This is Rwanda. Rwanda is a small country in Southeast Africa who has been independent for 60 years. This does not mean that it never had its conflicts. In fact, it had a major downfall during the 1900s, where over 800,000 people had died. This all dates back to World War I. During World War I, the Allies took over Germany's colonies in Africa, and after World War I, Belgium took over one of these colonies, Rwanda. Belgium took over Rwanda and completely changed their hierarchy. They gave the minority Tutsi people more privileges, mostly because they had better physical traits than the majority Hutus. Tutsis were the leaders, the pastures, and the high class of Rwanda, leaving Hutus and Twas at the very bottom. Belgium also made racial identification a requirement, where, once you were born, you were classified as a Tutsi, Hutu, or Twa. These cards would be ingrained to Rwanda for 80 years and would be a major contributor for the genocide 70 years later. Rwanda gained independence 50 years later in 1962. Their government shifted dramatically during this time because the Hutus practically destroyed this racial hierarchy that the Belgians left. While it was more open to Hutus, it left the Hutus and Tutsis under conflict for a very long time. The Hutus thought the Tutsis were inferior to them, since they were the majority versus the minority. This problem was left for 30 years, where eventually the UN had to diplomatically get involved to ensure peace in 1990. 3 years prior, however, the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, was born, where their objective was to protect the Tutsis from the hate of the Hutus. Eventually, they would get in conflict with the Rwandan militia, which then was followed by a civil war between the militia and the RPF for 3 years. The president, Juvenal Habyarimana, signed a peace treaty with the leader of the RPF, Paul Kagame, in 1993. This was called the Arusha Negotiations, where the UN was present, but the people, primarily the Hutus, did not accept this. They were angered that the treaty did not resolve any problems involving the racial debate and wanted to return back to fighting the Civil War. Tragedy struck when President Habyarimana's plane was shot down, killing him. The Hutus viewed the president as the savior of Rwanda. As a Hutu himself, he could have united Rwanda, all under the Hutus' power, of course. The Hutus, already fired up from war, were now pushed over their limits. Cut the tall trees, was said over the radio stations. And soon after, the Rwandan genocide had begun. The following 100 days was a genocide in which the Hutus had killed 800,000 Tutsis, with the death toll in total being over 1 million. Over 70% of all Tutsis were killed, and over 80% of the Twa were also killed. The genocide and the civil war they were fighting ended in 1994, once the RPF had captured the militia general Theonest Bagosora, which, under UN court, was found guilty as one of the perpetrators. The UN, an organization created to pursue peace and diplomacy around the globe, had abandoned Rwanda. Now, there are a few key reasons why the UN had chose to leave Rwanda. One reason is that 10 soldiers were killed, caught up in the genocide by accident. The UN had felt that by staying there, it would have increased the violence even more. Another reason is that the military had an overall decrease in size and budget and didn't want to spread their resources too far, in their eyes. More pressing concerns going on in other places. But one major reason why the UN had left Rwanda is because they didn't need to care. There was very little political influence and not a lot of news reporters and press. The press actually plays a huge role in support since they inform the world in what's going on. It also didn't help that the press were caught up in the genocide itself. When the people don't know what's going on at home, you don't need to care. The UN didn't have to do anything or spend precious resources because the people didn't make them. On the other hand, Africa as a whole was left to their own devices. Most colonies were now independent, and the UN didn't care what happened to them once they got their independence because they asked for it. According to Linda Melvern, an investigative journalist from Britain, the Belgian government was well aware of the risks in Rwanda and, in the weeks beforehand, pleaded with the US and UK diplomats at the United Nations to reinforce the pathetic, ineffectual peacekeeping mission they'd mandated for Rwanda. This very nicely coincides with a quote from Romeo Dallaire, a French Canadian commander and later Major General who went to Rwanda to help with the peacekeeping mission. He said that I sent a fax to the Belgian government, informing them of what had been happening nightly grenade attacks, political and racial assassinations, etc. I sent another after the president's plane was shot down. 10 days after, 10 soldiers were captured, tortured, and killed, where we then were asked to retreat. The operation had ended in a failure. Both Melbourne and Dallaire agreed that the UN knew what was going on and what was going to happen. They just didn't want to take the risk of furthering the bloodshed, which then led to the death of 800,000 people. In the aftermath of the genocide, the UN eventually got involved, mostly because Rwanda became a catalyst to many troubles across Africa, one of them being the African World War. The UN gave rehabilitation centers, education for orphan children, and officers to maintain peace and diplomacy. The press had also finally gotten involved in Rwanda, and now the UN had a lot of immigrant problems, but most importantly, criminals. People accused of being Tutsi slaughterers. The UN had set up the international court system thanks to the genocide. It had been in development since World War II, but they never had any reason to have it. After 3 sessions, the UN had declared its court in service. So after 4 decades, the court system was finally developed. So, in a way, the UN had become more involved in Africa because the genocide had forced them to. The UN had also declared after it had been established that it would be working on the Rwanda genocide case, persecuting anyone involved in the genocide and anyone who had helped. The UN had to establish a new government in Rwanda, where the militia was now underneath the government's power. The RPF had taken over the country and settled in as the new acting government in Rwanda, kicking out the old militia and adding in the RPF as the military, with Paul Kagame as their leader. Their goal was to ensure Tutsi protection and to reunite Rwanda under equality for all. So, in conclusion, the Rwandan genocide was caused by racial debate dating 80 years ago, and when it needed help, the UN had left them to their own devices for the sake of resources, money, publicity, and the protection of their soldiers. In the aftermath, the UN was forced to give much more resources and aid to Rwanda, and to nearby countries that would be affected. Rwanda's pain gave through the international court system and better funding towards the UNAMAR. Now, the UN is diplomatically much more involved in Africa than ever before.